You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
Hello everybody and welcome to the 7th episode of Social Europe Talk recorded in the European Parliament in Brussels. My name is Henning, Meyer, Editor-in-Chief of Social Europe. Today our topic is Europe after the European elections of 2019, and I'm really thrilled to be joined by three brilliant guests. To my left, Maria Demertzis, who's the Deputy Director of the think tank Bruegel here in Brussels. Professor Björn, who is from the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin. And last but certainly not least, Joao Rodrigues, who is a member of the European Parliament as well as president of the FEPS think tank based here in Brussels. Maria, let me start with you. What is your take on the European election? So how would you analyze it, and where do you see the dynamics of European politics and Europe in the context of the wider world after the election?
A very broad question. Let me ask with the first part. What are the messages I take after the European elections? I take two good messages actually. The first one is participation rate. I was very positively surprised with the Europeans going to the polls, voting for European parliamentarians. I think that's very good news. That gives legitimacy to the Parliament in ways that perhaps we had before, but now it's increased given that the numbers have increased. I think that's the first message I take, and it's a very good one. The other message I take is the results of the elections are such that the Parliament is a little bit more fragmented now by comparison to what it was, meaning that we have more parties that are of relevance, political relevance in the European Parliament. That, in my view, is a good message in the following sense. It would require consensus building. So 4, possibly 5 parties, it remains to be seen, of course, what the arithmetic is, will have to come together and will have to agree to a program for the next 5 years. That will be more difficult than what it used to be, but it will be good because it will build consensus. After that, the next message will be try to find the right person to execute this program, and that is the second stage. But I think consensus building in an era of conflicting and big problems is a good thing in my view.
Okay, Maria, you obviously have the inside perspective from the European Parliament. How do you see the recent developments?
Well, in fact, this is quite encouraging because with the higher turnout, we understand that more people understand also why we need more Europe to respond to the new challenge ahead of us. And we saw that there is an increasing concern to tackle climate change, to provide social fairness, to provide tax fairness, and to really defend fundamental rights and democracy. These are clear messages coming from the way the electorate has voted. The second interesting aspect is that we see that we could counter the national and contain, in fact, the national populist forces. And I would argue that we could also reduce the importance of the forces of the status quo, conservative and neoliberal forces. They were weakened by the outcome of this election, and that's why I think there is a chance to organize something like a more pro-European coalition of progressive forces.
Björn, I mean, a higher turnout, which is obviously very welcome, and also not as good a result for populists as many feared before the election. Would these also be two elements that you would highlight?
Absolutely, and I would add actually that so many people participated in this election, which nobody had expected before. I think this is a very important point that people say we need more cooperation and coordination in Europe. And this is something new because before the elections, people told us, okay, we have the ones who want to go back to the nation state and the others who want to stay the same in Europe in this muddling through mode. And I think with this muddling through mode, we cannot tackle the global problems. And therefore, we have to change towards a mode where we really act towards more cooperation, for example, in climate change. Maria Joao was mentioning that, for example, with regard to monetary union, for example, with regard to social division and many other more aspects. And I think people want that, and now is a chance for the next 5 years to go into this direction.
And Maria, you mentioned in your initial statement that you see now a chance for consensus building that hasn't been there before. So what would your priorities be? What would you like to use this consensus building capacity for? So what do you think are the important issues that European legislators have to address in the next 5 years?
Well, I mean, let me join my fellow panelists on the issue of the climate change. I think that should be the number one priority for the next Commission, for the next European Parliament. Quite frankly, for all capital governments, we need to concentrate on fighting climate change, reversing climate change. Europe had a very leading role in this discussion, and I welcome that. But it's not enough. We need much more. We need thorough changes when it comes even down to our own behavior when it comes to climate change. And I think we need to concentrate a lot of effort in trying, be an example in this respect. So climate change will be my number one priority. Now, second to that, we are seeing challenges coming from outside. Challenges coming on the trade side, from the US primarily, but also challenges coming from China. China is becoming a global player that is going to follow a slightly different business model to the one that we are following. What does that mean about Europe's position in the world? Can we protect our welfare systems, our growth models, when we're having basically new players coming in? So I think there Europe needs to find a new place in the, if I may call it, new world order. And that is something that in Europe the discussion is only beginning to take off. And the third one, of course, is the problems that we've had up till now. Euro reform. Do we need more Europe? What type of more Europe do we need? What is the role for economic policy at the euro area level? And there the discussion will continue. We are now in non-crisis mode. It's a good time to think about the structural changes. It is a difficult discussion. We have reform fatigue in Europe, but it's a discussion that we need to contain and we need to maintain having.
Yeah. And Maria, before we come to the domestic and the reform issues within the European Union, I mean, would you agree that Europe will have to be outward looking in a different way now, given the tensions that are, being created, not least by the US-China trade war, all sorts of other tensions that are developing around the world. So where do you see, how does Europe need to change its positioning in the global scene in the next few years?
Yeah. I agree this is a fundamental issue because we are dealing with a completely different world. Very different from the one we had 5 years ago when we were elected for this concluding legislative. And what we see is that the multilateral system is being weakened by this crossfire between different global players. And now there is a very relevant one between the United States and China. And we need to assert our own way. When it comes to trade, this is so clear because, yes, we are open to trade agreements, but providing they are also leveraging social and environmental standards in Europe and outside in the rest of the world. When we see the climate change, we Europeans, we need to be in the lead of promoting these sustainable development goals as our main compass. This is about energy transition, but energy transition with social fairness. This is really the central political challenge for the years ahead. And then let me also refer to another one, which is the digital revolution, because we see an American way to drive the digital revolution, which is driven by markets with a business model which is in fact sacrificing very important values for us. And then we see the Chinese way, driven by the state, also sacrificing key values for us. So this is a moment for us to assert the European way to drive the digital revolution, which should be respecting our privacy, our personal preferences, which should ensure that we have decent labor conditions and access to social protection, and which must respect democracy. We cannot accept our democratic institutions being manipulated. So European sovereignty must also be digital sovereignty, or we are just losing control of the situation.
I totally agree. Yeah. I totally agree with both of them because we should be proud of our European economic, social and democratic model and should defend it in the world as an export model, maybe, for other states. but nevertheless, we should concentrate as well on the problems we have here, because globalization, when we talk about globalization has always this dark side, the side of discontent. And this discontent was partly catalyzed by the European Union. If you talk, for example, about our single market, we have the single market, but we haven't yet prevented really social dumping in many respects. We have a common monetary union with a common monetary policy, but we don't have yet a common financial center where we really coordinate our fiscal policies. If you look at Schengen, for example, we have free movement of persons, but we forgot for a long time to talk about a common frontier and common asylum and migration policies. And these are the deficits here. And if we could tackle these deficits, it would be easier to be proud of our model and to tell the world, here is our European democratic social and economic model.
Yeah, and okay, we've outlined a few broad issues, I would say, but and that's one of the advantages of this kind of format. Let's go into the nitty-gritty details. You said, Maria, that climate change should be top of the agenda. What exactly would you expect the European Union, the European Parliament, and different national actors to do in policy terms to address this issue?
Well, certainly there is scope for regulation. I think that's very important. The incentivizing of the use of clean technology. That's certainly true. I mean, there are the possibility of renewable energy. That should be the standard solution to many countries in Europe who can exploit that. So any tax incentives that you can give in the context of cleaning up energy, that is the obvious thing to do. I think we need to put the cost, even though I am an economist and I understand the cost benefits, I think we cannot imagine what the costs are going to be in the future if we don't do it now. So investments in this respect are crucial in order to ensure the sustainability of our policies. Now, next to that, I think the issue of sustainable finance is as important. So greening up investments, greening up monetary policy possibly, these are all discussions that we need to have. The sustainability of our financing system, it needs to move in a direction and it needs to be consistent with the investments, the types of investments that we need to see. But beyond that, I think there is also great space for us individually to progress in this respect. I don't believe we're going to meet the 2030 targets. I don't believe we're going to meet the 2050 targets unless we chase consumption in ways that are radical. And there, I think every single one of us has got a responsibility for that. And I think that every one of us has got a role to play, the governments, the financial institutions, and the individuals.
You say basically people should change their consumption patterns. What would you recommend? What should they do?
Well, I think that is a difficult question. I mean, you think about your next holidays. Where do you go for the next holidays? I think you need to think about the footprint of your next holidays or your next business trip. Do I really need to be there? These are the types of adjustments that we are going to have to make, not to name but few, if we are going to take the issue of climate change seriously, in my view.
But they need to be socially balanced in the end, because if not, who is paying then for that? With the consumption,
that's right.
Which is
indeed, that is a very good point. I was hoping to bring this in the next round, but I think since you brought it, it's a very important one. The Gilets jaunes example is a very important example in that direction, where here we have a climate policy, an energy policy that is actually very well meant. It is very well meant. It is for all of us to reach our climate objectives. But the burden of the adjustment falls disproportionately on the socially weak. And that cannot be ignored. It cannot be ignored. So any policy that we put on the issue of on the climate needs to be followed and accompanied with measures that are going to ease the burden, distribute the burden slightly more equitably across society. I think that's a very important point.
And Maria, where would you see the elements of a socially balanced climate policy?
Yeah. No, good implication also is for jobs. Because let me give an example. Everybody knows that we need to have an active industrial policy to move from carbon emission cars to clean cars, electric cars. And we have a choice about this. The choice is if we don't move fast enough, Europe will lose a lot of jobs. Because we have other competitors, notably China, who are now trying to take the lead in this. And if Europe is not quick enough to move to electric cars, we'll lose a lot of jobs. But on the other hand, to move from the current car industry to electric car also means to destroy jobs. So what should we do? This is the dilemma. And the way to deal with this dilemma, yes, we need to be bold on setting new standards for the cars, but we need to help all the workers to move to the new jobs. With active labor market policies, with supporting the new companies, creating these new jobs, and with retraining people for these new jobs. Otherwise, we have a transition, but an unfair transition, and this is unacceptable.
And Björn, how do you see these developments? I mean, you already mentioned the need to socially balance. In the area in Germany where the two of us live, we are seeing a similar structural change where coal mining is being phased out, where exactly these issues are being discussed. How can this transition be managed in a socially inclusive fashion? Not sure whether it can be inclusive, but how can you ameliorate the effects as best as possible? So what is your take on this? Have we seen a way to do this properly, or do we need to think deep and hard again about how to do this?
Well, one important thing is, if not just few people should take the costs of the climate change or the new measures we want, then we have to work very broad on this, for example, with infrastructure projects which go into this direction, talking about lower emissions, for example, and other things. And the question, who should finance these infrastructure projects? If it's not done by the privates, because we're still living in a time where private investments are relatively low and might be lower in the future years, because we might be seeing the next economic downturn, and then the state has to move in, of course, to help bring these projects forward. And the same holds true for people who have to be trained for new jobs, of course. You cannot tell people, okay, now we have climate change and we are closing, for example, coal mining down, and well, you look for something else in the digital world. That will not work. So the state has to do a lot on training and retraining and help people to find something new jobs, new areas in the digital world, which is hopefully not that polluting the environment like coal mining and other areas of the old industries.
And this gives us a nice segue into the other topic I wanted to talk about, which is economic policy and economic policy priorities. I mean, there seems to be a increasing polarization between city and rural areas in terms of economic opportunity and infrastructure investment. Basically connecting, taking money and build the infrastructure that can connect more areas to the economic opportunities of the cities seems to be an important way to go. But at the same time, we always talk about the limits of what can be done with public investment. So if you sort of try to make the connection between socially balanced climate change and investment and economic policy priorities, how would you transfer this into the economic policy area?
I think it depends on which country you think about. The scenario you just described is not unique across Europe. If you are in the south of Europe, the issue of youth unemployment is a lot more prominent, that the divide, the city versus countryside divide. And I think that is probably right for a number of countries. If you're in Eastern Europe, that yet again is a different problem. In Eastern Europe, you have the issue of the brain drain, where people are just picking up and leaving. And there you're having a double whammy of country actually training young people, educating young people, and therefore incurring the cost of training young people. And then those people leave and go somewhere else where they actually produce output, so the return on the investment is somewhere else. So I think you cannot have a prescription simply based on the scenario you just described, and therefore you need different answers to different things. I mean, if you were to start with Eastern Europe, I think that's a very interesting thing. When the young leave, the prospects of a country developing is very, very difficult. A set of policies that are going to reverse that will be crucial, because you're talking about the most productive part of the society. If you're talking about Germany and if you're talking about France, yes, the country versus city divide is a lot more prominent, and there I think infrastructure investments are important. I think the European Commission has been driving this message to these countries, infrastructure investments, for a very long time. I think it's about time you do that, depending on the fiscal space that's available. Key role for the state there, and why we're not making progress there. If you're talking about Southern Europe, then is a youth unemployment thing. And there I think lifetime training and ways of reskilling the young and the not so young who have been unemployed for a long time, that is now a prescription for those countries that are having Spain, Greece, Italy, Portugal, that have the youth unemployment issue is much more important in priorities before you can do that. So I think we need to We need to be careful not to have one single prescription because the problems are not the same elsewhere, everywhere. And I think incentives in those directions will be important. I see a very clear role for the European Parliament in this respect to point out the fact that there isn't just the one policy that will do, one size fits all, but I also see a very big role for the Commission there, and I've seen the Commission does play that role very well in my opinion.
And Maria, maybe I shouldn't have termed it the city rural areas, but more center periphery, which can within one country be cities and rural areas, but within a space of countries could be brain drain from one country to another. So it's just basically the argument was in a time where we see economic prosperity and development opportunities being clustered in certain areas, and by process taken away from elsewhere. What can we do to make sure everybody, inclusive growth was one of the agenda items. So what can we do going forward to make, if we generate growth, it is actually inclusive?
Well, I think it's very important to bring back the concern with cohesion, economic and social cohesion in the European Union, and upward convergence. Because otherwise we cannot overcome this situation of fragmentation we do have in the European Union. And this has to do with the role of the upcoming community budget. Do you have the resources for this? To tackle all these priorities? Are we really giving the opportunities for all member states to invest where they need to invest? And this brings us to the other problem is where can we get the resources? And I don't believe in this fallacy saying that, we are squeezed, we don't have resources. No, look, of course we don't want to ask citizens to pay more taxes. It's out of question. We are not asking SMEs to pay more taxes. But we know there are untapped sources of tax revenue, particularly in the financial area, in the pollution area, and in the digital area. Let me give you an example. The big online platforms, they are using the single market in full. So they should pay their taxes because they benefit from the single market. They are asking us to provide the necessary educated, trained workforce. But if this is the case, to make the best of the digital revolution, they should pay their digital taxes for us to finance the necessary education and training. So something is missing in our tax policy in order to have more social fairness.
And Björn, you mentioned the fiscal space. Let's dive into both sides of this, into the revenue side and into the expenditure side. But let's start with the expenditure side. I mean, there has been a fiscal policy dominant in the European Union which has not been conducive for investment. What needs to change according to your view?
We organize the monetary union, which is organized in the sense of a stability union, where austerity for crisis tackling is the most important thing, where the balance of the budgets of the single member states is the most important thing, and where investments, for example, for infrastructure, for climate change, for digitalization, and all these social issues, they don't play a role. And actually, this is not a new problem. We discussed this already when we founded Monetary Union, and there were many, many economists at the time who told us this will not work very well for a long time. And now in the Euro crisis, we realized, okay, we have to go this way towards a fiscal union. But what have we done? We don't have a real common Eurozone budget yet, which would help to tackle asymmetric shocks, because the European Central Bank can only tackle shocks which are for the whole countries and not only for single countries. We still have this tax competition, for example. We still have a lot of social problems in many member states. You mentioned the youth unemployment rates. Of course, they are going down now with a better economic climate in the last years, but still youth unemployment and the general unemployment as well, and the poverty measure, the poverty rates, they are way too high in Spain, in Portugal, in all the countries in crisis. And what we see then politically, if you look at Italy, for example, the climate will change, and then soon, like in Italy, you will have some populist politicians in the government and saying, okay, we're not following this path anymore. So I would plead for going this road towards a fiscal union, because we have no other chance. If we don't have a sort of common economic center, call it European economic government, call it a European finance minister, a European treasury, whatever. But we need a place where we really can discuss in a sort of new macroeconomic dialogue between the main economic partners like employers, employees, organizations like European Central Bank, the European Commission, and representatives of the European Parliament and of the member states. Where the situation in Europe is and what we need to prevent the next crisis. Because the next crisis might be too hard for the Eurozone. Or we see it not in an economic sense, but the crisis will be really strong in a political sense, that we have this populists like in Italy and other countries who say, okay, then we don't want to have the euro as a common money anymore, a common currency anymore, and we're stepping out.
And Maria,
yes.
I'm interested in your opinion on the fiscal policy space and what needs to change in fiscal policy, but let's also take the revenue side into consideration, because there seem to be three interlocking problems. The one is about tax competition, about headline rates, but nobody's paying the headline rate anyways. It's regulatory arbitrage, where you can sort of bounce taxes off between different countries. And the fundamental problem seems to be that digital companies, and not just digital companies, but also digitizing companies, because it's going to become worse than better. The way we calculate the tax base doesn't really fit the way companies operate in this space. Right. So what can we do, especially in, can we move towards sort of a uniform way to calculate the tax base, which would already be a way forward? I mean, at the G20, there was a effective minimum tax now being proposed. Reason being is that otherwise it's very, very difficult to have a joint tax base on which to calculate what taxes are due, let alone competition about the headline tax rate. So I would be interested in your opinion on the fiscal policy space as well as the revenue side, how to reform taxation.
Yeah, lots of things in your arguments, but I mean, if I were to prioritize, because they're sort of about where would you start from, I would start from the third one, and I think Maria made the same point. The issue of being able to tax digital services or digitalized services in a way that we all understand and we think is fair is the way forward, in my view. That's one that I think there is great space here for the European authorities to do something on this respect. And you could even think about own sources. I mean, you could think of it as that way. But more importantly, I think societies and electoral outcomes have demonstrated that we need solutions to this problem, because the perception in our society is that this is very unfair, and therefore we need to tackle this in a way that actually distributes the perceptions. So I think that is a good thing, and one that we can actually make progress in. Now, on the tax coordination, there I'm less optimistic, but also I think that a little bit of competition between taxes fits business models of countries. So long as we believe in sort of nation states that do things differently, it's very difficult to think of countries not competing. If it's not on this, it will be on something else. So the competition side between countries is part of what it is. And of course, there are arguments of leveling the playing field. I understand that, but we don't have one country. We have 28 countries, probably 27 in the future, or possibly more in the future. So there will be, so long as you have countries, you will have competition on business models or way of doing things. If it's not on the tax side, it will be on something else. Now, you can ask the question, and I think you would be right to ask the question, how compatible is that with the single market? That would be a good question to ask, and I think we need to have measures that are consistent with our ambitions on the single market. And there are good reasons for tax harmonization, at least at some parts. The digital part is a good way to start. So that's on the revenue side. On the fiscal side, I hope we will have a minute to talk about the European architecture, because I think there is a lot to say there which pertains to fiscal issues. But the one thing I'd like to say is that we need to go back to this investment rule. I think the investment needs that Europe has in the context of the broader global scene are very much on innovation. Innovation is the thing that is going to guarantee the future of our children, the future of next generations. Investments is what we need to get to innovation, to get to good outcomes. And therefore, I think we need to find a more intelligent way of dealing with investments. I'm not saying we shouldn't coordinate. We should coordinate. We should follow fiscal rules, because there's good reasons why we have fiscal rules. Not everybody has the same fiscal space, and we need to make sure that fiscal decisions taken in one country do not contaminate policies in other countries. I think that's important.
And they shouldn't be pro-cyclical.
And they shouldn't be pro-cyclical. Now, that is something that, of course,
and you should probably treat investment and consumption differently.
That is exactly my point. I think we should go back to the investment rule. We need to differentiate spending, whether it's spending for consumption, whether it's cyclical or pro-cyclical, and investment. I think I cannot emphasize this argument. It's not a new argument. It's a very old argument. But this is the time to do it. I think we should waste no time when it comes to differentiating investments.
Maria, back to the golden rule where we borrow to invest and balance consumption over the business cycle.
Look, I agree that of course we need to revisit our fiscal rules to create this room for investment, which is crucial for everybody in different sense. Nevertheless, we know that because we need to comply with the common fiscal discipline, fiscal responsibility, we need to complement national budgets with European instruments. And so this is the role of the community budget as a whole, which is mainly a budget for investment. This should also be the role of fiscal capacity for the Eurozone. Because let me recall, we are still waiting for this, waiting for Godot. And we need to stop this. Because we know that all monetary zones in the world, they do have an instrument to provide stabilization and fighting asymmetric shocks. Björn was referring to this. I would argue we also need an instrument to support upward economic and social convergence exactly by financing the necessary investments. And now we are waiting for the upcoming Euro Summit to deliver on something, and the new Parliament. The new European Parliament must be very active about this.
And do you think we have a good chance now going forward with the new political dynamics that we have some real progress over the next parliamentary term?
Look, I really hope that to complete the economic and monetary union remains an essential priority for the upcoming European Commission and the upcoming European Parliament. Let's see.
Okay. Well, you wanted to talk about the architecture as well.
We are going in this direction. I think that is architecture, yes.
What would your reform proposals be? What kind of things would you change?
So I would have to pick my battles, right? I mean, like we would have to pick battles, which battles to fight. I think the one battle I would definitely pick would be completing the banking union. The reason why the banking union has stopped is because the last leg of the banking union is a fiscal leg. And it is an interesting one that we cannot find the money, even if it's notional money. That's an interesting part. We cannot find that. We cannot find agreement there. And I think the progress that we've made on banking union, which is crucial for the resilience of the European Monetary Union, should not be jeopardized by our inability to go that extra mile. That extra mile is, and I remind you, these are things we have agreed upon. It's not that we're waiting to agree. What we are waiting to do is just complete it. Yeah, that is the only thing that we're missing. Well, it is the only thing, but it is a big thing because we cannot get agreement. I would fight that battle before I fight anything else. We can make progress on capital markets union again on the financial side. It's a good thing, but I don't see that they will make much progress because cultural issues come into the capital markets union that are not easy to legislate away or we cannot ease those away. The other thing I would do, and if I would go in the direction of a common budget, and I would fight it in this way, would be on the unemployment reinsurance. I think that would be something that I would like to see done, let's say in the next 10 years, maybe 2 commissions from now, not maybe 2 parliamentary cycles from now. I think there is both understanding that on the smoothing of the shocks in the way you described it, Björn, this would be a very good instrument to have, the unemployment reinsurance, because it complements the cycle. And it's not pro-cyclical again, but it is something that is very specific, dedicated to very specific issues. And I think there we can fight that battle with some progress. A common euro area budget, yes, it would be tremendous from a design point of view. If I was an architect and I was designing this on paper, this is exactly what I would do. But I remind you that in order to get to a common budget, irrespective of how big or how small this budget is, you need also a political union. You need to elect parliamentarians in a different way than we elect today for accountability purposes. So the leap in the governance structure that we need to get into a legitimate euro area budget that is economically meaningful is enormous. And I don't know that as a citizens we are ready to do that. We are ready to go to effectively a federation. That's what I mean by that. I would like to see it, but whether I will see it in my lifetime, I don't know. Short of that, I think there are things that we can do to improve the architecture, starting with the small things, finishing the things we have agreed upon, progressing with things we haven't quite agreed upon, but we all understand that there are good things to manage shocks, and maintaining an ambitious agenda for generations to come.
Okay, and Maria just made a very nice segue into another topic that I briefly towards the end of the show wanted to talk about, which is where can we take social policy?
Oh, social policy.
In the next parliament, because we talked about the unemployment reinsurance. It's got a fiscal function, but at the same time, obviously, it would provide a social policy backstop.
Absolutely.
On the European level. So we've had some progress in the last parliament, not least due to the effort of Joao, who is here with us today. But where should these efforts be taken in the next years?
Yeah. The main effort was this European pillar of social rights. I always keep it with me. And, I think this is really important, these 20 principles, but these are of course no real rights because they are not enshrined in the treaties. They are it's just a declaration of intent. So what shall we tell citizens? Okay, you have now this thing, you can look for it, but you don't have real rights, and we need to combine these rights. Well, two things. One thing is we should bring them into the treaties. I don't know if that will happen in the next 5 years. But with the next treaty revision, this should be a point. And if not all member states want to follow on this, why not talking about a European social protocol? We did that at Maastricht, at the Maastricht Treaty at the time as well, when Great Britain said, no, we don't want to sign any social things for the common market. Why not doing, again, a social compact, for example, like the fiscal compact, now doing a social compact. Yeah? And the second thing, most importantly, therefore, the European Pillar of Social Rights is we need minimum standards. Because it's written a lot of times, you should have pensions which are adequate. Yeah? You should have health service which is adequate. Adequate, what means adequate? I counted it like 12 times they mentioned the word adequate. But what means adequate? So we have to look for minimum standards, but not in that, you mentioned that, Maria, this one-size-fits-all approach. We have done this one-size-fits-all approach too long a time, and I think now it's time for looking at the member states. They have different welfare models. They are on different socioeconomic standards and in different economic cycles, and therefore we need standards like, for example, a minimum wage, which is not one minimum wage, of course, for all the countries participating in the European Union, or if we take, for example, only the Eurozone, the 19 Eurozone members, but this minimum wage would be, for example, 60% of the median wage, which is paid in the single member states. And this could be one thing to bring forward this European Pillar of Social Rights in order to at least have a new balance between social rights on the one side and on the other side, this market integration, because market enhancement was all the time very, very important compared to social integration.
Maria, as one of the key people who drove this agenda forward, where do you want to see it go in the next 3 years? What do you think are the development steps it needs to take now?
Well, let me tell you a small story about this, is that when we were preparing the report on the European Pillar of Social Rights here, we had a very difficult choice to be made, because I was guiding this report, I was the rapporteur, but I was also confronted with the Council of Ministers, where several governments were telling us we don't need this. We don't need a European social pillar. And so in a certain moment I was asked, well, Maria, perhaps it's better that we just limit the social pillar to the Eurozone. And I said, no way. The European Pillar of Social Rights is for all citizens. We cannot have citizens of first class and citizens of second class. And so the Parliament was very clear about this. And then, with a large majority we got in the Parliament, we opened negotiations with the Council of Ministers. And with this large majority backing our position, we could convince all the governments to accept. And that's why Gothenburg proclamation was possible, with all the governments on board. Now, what can we do with this strong, high-level political commitment? Well, let me tell you, we start turning this pillar in something concrete. We have adopted several directives. We have adopted, let's say, a new orientation for economic and social policies, and we are translating these into new financial instruments. The new social fund, the investment plan, paying much more attention to social investment, the discussion about the child guarantee as an example of this, or to strengthen the youth guarantee. But if I go back to the directives, this is important because for many years, particularly the so-called Barroso period, social legislation was almost frozen. And now we could introduce a new directive improving working conditions for everyone, whatever the job, whatever the sector, and saying that all people in Europe should have a decent labor contract plus access to social protection. This is very important. This is for almost 300 million workers. Then we introduced a new directive on work-life balance. We extended the access to social protection to self-employed people. So these are very important innovations. And the starting point for this is to say, yes, we want everybody to have updated social rights. Now we count on the next European Parliament to go on delivering on this promise of the European Social Pillar.
So basically making what Björn was saying, turning these principles into tangible, effective rules that then people can rely on. So time flies when you're having fun. So we're already at the final round. So we talked about a whole lot of issues. And the final question, as most times, would be if you were the agenda setter here as a policymaker, what would your top 3 things be that you would, go for first, second, and third? So where would you start in trying to sort of deal with some of the issues that we've just talked about?
One issue we have not talked about, but I think is very important in my view, is this issue of the what I call governance. And it goes down to things like the rule of law primarily. We've seen regression in Europe on the rule of law issues. So I would strongly advocate for ensuring from Brussels, but also from the capitals, that the rule of law is promoted and is maintained and is preserved, because regressing on democracy implies that we're building castles in the sand and that we can't build anything without a democratic regime. So I would say don't forget the governance issue, because, and the Commission has made huge progress in this respect. So I would say the first one would be that, and it's a pity we haven't talked about it. The second one is climate change, no doubt. I think that would be an important thing. And the third one is the economy. It always is the economy. You have to make sure that you can provide for jobs and employment for people. But if I may advocate also for a principle, because I think the principle of policies is also important, I would go back to what Maria said in this issue of cohesiveness. All policies need to be cohesive and inclusive, because if they are not, they will strongly jeopardize Europe.
Björn, what would you do?
Well, the first point would be less markets, more politics, I would call it.
I think I know somebody who wrote a book about
maybe.
this.
And because I think this would be important to tackle global risk, what I talked about before, about this dark side of globalization, that we really have to show that we can tackle these things by doing politics and not by believing in self-fulfilling promises of the market. The market always has to have a certain framework, actually, and this has to be done politically. And we have to tell people, show people that politicians are able to organize this framework. So secondly, this would be monetary union, because we had too long a crisis, this euro crisis, and we haven't tackled monetary union. You said even the banking union is not complete. And when the next crisis looms around the corner, we are not prepared yet for that crisis. And I fear that monetary union will break up, and that will have vast consequences, of course, on the economy in general. And the third thing would be for me then this new balance of social issues and economic issues. So social principles on the same footing, like for example, the budgetary planning in the monetary union, and of certain other aspects of the single market and monetary union.
Maria, the final word is yours.
Well, I think I will go for a digital tax to finance lifelong learning for all. I will go to a carbon tax to finance the jobs of the future for those who are losing jobs. And I will finance a powerful Erasmus for those who want to have an Erasmus experience, because this changes our life.
Very tangible proposals. Thank you very much, everybody here at the table, and thank you very much for listening to this. I'm afraid this is all we have time for today, and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.